Welcome back to another episode of Revving Up with Revving Consulting. I'm your host, Matt Haller, and I'm joined with my co-host, Quang Do. Hey Quang, how are you?
I'm doing well.
We're excited for another awesome episode. We're diving into our revenue growth strategies and tactics, and we're thrilled to be joined this week with George Leith, who's the President of International Partnerships at AdCellerant. Welcome to Revving Up, George.
Great to be here.
This episode is particularly special for me. We've known each other for a long time, I think almost a decade now, or maybe a little bit longer. And my very first podcast experience was with you. So super excited. Thank you again for joining us. First question for me is, one might look at your LinkedIn and could say, well, this guy has always wanted to be in sales. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, from the very first thing on your profile to the very last thing. But I imagine that's probably not entirely true. So help us understand how you found sales and why you've stayed in it. And what do you love about it?
Well, that's a big question. I didn't want to be in sales. That wasn't what I set out to do. I wanted to be a play-by-play hockey guy. Growing up on the prairies in Western Saskatchewan, I couldn't play hockey worth shit. So I thought, well, next best thing would be to be Bob Cole, legendary Bob Cole from Hockey Night in Canada. But then I realized very quickly that $500 a month wasn't going to pay the bills. And the general manager who had coerced me into doing play-by-play hockey at 17 years old, right out of high school, said, well, you could sell the ads too. And I said, well, how hard could that be? So yeah, with some of the most scintillating sales training ever in the history of selling, a one-sheeter, and that was it. I started selling ads on the broadcast that I was hosting and didn't know how to do either of those two jobs at 17. But that's really where it all started.
And as you think back to those early sales lessons, what was kind of your first takeaways from that first sales job? And were anything that you still remember, you still use today from that first job in your kind of day-to-day?
Well, it's interesting. There was an insurance sales guy, and I wish I could remember his name because I've quoted the story numerous times. We would go for coffee when we weren't selling, which was, 3 days a week in the mornings. And his line was, moving salesman or salesperson attracts business. And I've always subscribed to that because, we would be at that breakfast at the local coffee shop and he would run into a prospect or an existing customer. In today's day and age where we aren't always in rooms of coffee shops or networking events, I've equated that to your phone's ringing or your email's happening or you're getting a direct message or somebody's reached out to you on LinkedIn, but you need to be in the room. And now it's virtual rooms. You need to be in those rooms. And if you don't have some of that volume of communication happening, you're shit out of luck.
And George, talk us through how you made the change from, salesperson to sales management and sales leadership. Especially, I knew you probably the most when you were at Vendasta and moved from VP of sales to chief revenue officer, chief customer officer. How did your role change and how did you manage, all the different valences of that part of your career?
I've thought a lot about it, especially in the last year. Maybe just being a top salesperson would be better than all of those other jobs. Being an individual contributor and dealing with your client base and not having to put up with the bullshit of having direct headcount and having to report to a board. God, those were good days. But eventually somebody's got to lead. And I actually really enjoy the mentorship portion of leading and helping young, impressionable, and moldable sales professionals achieve their dreams and their goals. That is one of the more satisfying things out there. I have learned very recently, although Quang, when you and I met 10 years ago, I was learning at that time as well. Trying to take somebody my age or a little bit older or maybe even a little bit younger and show them that there's new ways to do things, not the most satisfying job out there. Actually, I would rather do a number of different, very painful things than do that. And that's not taking anything away from those individuals that are very good at what they do and their singular focus that they have, and they've been doing it for a long time. I'm very respectful to all of that. But I think that molding people who are prepared to be molded would be a hell of a lot more satisfying when you're in a leadership position.
The best sales managers are forged in the fires of their most difficult reps. But I'm curious, as you're going through your early days of becoming a manager, was there a moment that you're like, I'm going to continue on this management path? Or did you kind of bounce around from IC to manager and try out different flavors of what those different types of sales jobs would look like to try on the one that was best for you?
I don't think that there was a game plan or a strategy. I wish, Matt, that I could show you a document and roadmap and things like that. It was more school of hard knocks around what my leadership and management style would be. I do believe this, and it's very debatable. And I've got into very aggressive debates about this, but I believe sales is the one job that people will not follow someone who can't do. And the leaders that say, no, 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 I'm able to do this and I never sold, that your team is lying to you, that they truly believe that you have the answers. Like it's just not a thing. There's a very famous scene from the movie Wolf of Wall Street where Leo does the Jordan Belfort thing where he, right in front of the group of misfits, gets on the phone and closes the deal. Now, I don't subscribe to any of a lot of that movie, and especially the way that they treated customers, but I do believe that that call in front of the team, regardless of how it went, would show that you are prepared to do the things that you're asking your team to do. And that's the piece that I think is so important when it comes to leadership. So I believe in the playing coach component. And some of the debate that I've had back is, well, yeah, but Gretzky was the greatest hockey player ever, but he was a shitty coach. Yeah, he didn't get the results that were behind the bench in the NHL, but I bet you there are a lot of players over the years that have learned a lot from Wayne Gretzky. So, I know there's two schools of thought on that, but I do believe in sales. If you cannot do, it's really friggin' tough to lead.
And then even if you can do, that doesn't mean that you're the best educator, the best teacher, because the best reps have got their process and they might be able to communicate what their process is. That doesn't mean that they can make the next rep go through that process with the same results and efficacy as them.
Yeah, repeatable sales process is ultimately born out of the software business. In the last 10 to 15 years in this chief revenue officer role, that is a combination of being an accountant and a data scientist, along with being a coach and a mentor. And you got to have some learning management component in there as well. But you're right. We're all looking for this repeatable process. And I don't think that it's ever done. I think that's the one thing that people have to get their heads around. It's moving too fast. The systems that we had in place 36 months ago might even be outdated today. And what you're looking for is a repeatable outcome. And that repeatable outcome has changed in the last 4 years when money isn't as plentiful. The venture capital dollars aren't being thrown around. And you can see that revenue leadership has changed again to be profitable revenue, right? That's what everybody's talking about. So I think that one of the most important pieces of building that repeatable process and the repeatable outcomes is the ability to pivot and the ability to recognize when you need to pivot and running experiments all the time to be able to figure out what are the tweaks that you can make to the model. Because your job at the end of the day is to be a steward of capital and to deliver a return on those dollars that you've been entrusted with.
And how do you manage that? How do you manage running experiments, right? Because I think one could argue that, hey, if you experiment too much or you experiment before you can correctly or fully assess the things you're doing now, like how do you manage that in an organization? I have the benefit of seeing you work in person. I remember when you were doing this thing where you were listening to sales reps' calls. And if I remember correctly, it was the best and the worst call every week. You would personally listen to pretty much all the calls or the majority of them, and then you would present that to the leadership team. And it was such a cool thing. But yeah, just curious, how do you run experiments in a way that doesn't create chaos?
That's a good one because there's a great story behind that. We couldn't afford the expensive software. I don't know if I can use name brands on the call, but there's a really expensive piece of software out there, 4 letters long, starts with a G, ends with a G. We couldn't afford that. And we had to go for this other piece of software that I found from a startup out of India and then negotiate a really good deal with those folks. And so technology is part of how I believe that you do that. And now we have AI, an amazing thing that is. Like, what a waste of time it was learning all that Revving Up shit because I could have just used AI. If I would have known that, I would have saved me a whole bunch. And then constant learning. Meeting folks like you over the years and not being afraid to ask questions and not being afraid to have people be critical of the things that you were doing, not be that landlord of, I have all the answers, being tech savvy and learning that you don't know what you don't know. So you're always looking for new things. And then that constant learning. My Saturday morning, if I'm at home in the hot tub, it's a couple hours with a cup of coffee and you're doing the podcasts and you're reading and you're trying to stay on top of something that you'll never be fully on top of. But I actually think that that's part of the fun.
Definitely.
Can you take us through your journey at Vendasta? Because if I look at your career, it looks like there was a period of time when you had a couple of different places that you worked at for a good period of time, but then a long stint where you really grew with that company. And I guess there's 2 questions I have. The first one is, when did you feel like you found your tribe? For all the people who are listening and thinking, I haven't found the place that I've worked at for 10 years. And then how did you know that that was the place and that ultimately kept you there for 10 years?
I'm good at tricking people. If you look at the LinkedIn profile, there are pieces of that 10-year journey that were very different. First sales hire, Brendan King, who I've known for 30 some odd years. I kept seeing him on Fridays at happy hour, and he kept showing up with more and more software developers. And then finally, he was looking for a sales guy, and we had that conversation, and I was ready for something new. I was almost going to go back into media. Thank goodness that I met Brendan, and I was able to still work adjacent to media, but to really be deeply embedded into technology and learn it from the ground up. And then we had 2 salespeople, and then we had 5 salespeople, and then we had 10 salespeople. And then about a year and a half, we were rolling with that. And then the phone call came to pack it up and get on a plane and get back home because we're going to build an inside sales team. And actually, last week, I was in Toronto with the mentor that taught us how to do that, Butch Langlois, and had a great conversation with him. We've stayed in touch over the years. And then things really started to take off because we did the triple double, and it was very sales led. Sorry to the product teams, but in those early days, it was very sales led. And then we started to do customer success across the product stack. So we had the software teams that built product, but we needed to use that product. And we had a team of people that did that work. I called them wolves in sheep's clothing because they would upsell as they identified opportunity working with the customers. And then at the end of it, you've got a 250 person customer facing team that broke the 100 million annual recurring revenue. And you're 10 years in looking at what the next move will be. And, in there was VP of sales. If I were hiring a VP of sales today, I don't know if I would have been the guy at that time, but, we're longer down the road. CRO, Brendan warned me that I probably didn't want that job because you're the guy that gets fired if you don't hit the numbers. And the move to CCO was at the end of the day to protect me from that. And I wasn't the data-driven guy then. I definitely am now. I learned that as time went on, but then probably wasn't the right role. So, you're sitting here and you look at it on paper and you're like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of cool. And that's kind of cool. And that's kind of cool. But there literally were moments where I was like, this isn't for me. Give me a couple $1,000,000 and I'll go get you 4 and give me a small team again. And we did have a couple of those where we internationalized. That was probably the most fun that I had was, okay, here's a budget. You get to pick your team and go get it. And God, that was fun. Very similar to what's on the LinkedIn profile today.
What brought you to AdCellerant? Of all the choices, of all the possibilities, why this particular role at this point in time in your career, George?
I admire Brock Berry and Shelby and Chris, the founding team there and what they've built. I've known them for a long time. I was very fortunate and humbled when I left Vendasta. I don't think that anybody saw that coming, including my wife and myself and Brendan and the teams. And I had a number of folks reach out to me and said, if we would have known that you were on the market, we would have had a conversation. So I'm very blessed by that and very humbled by that. So, coming out of the turnaround that Matt Hill asked me to embark on at Harvard Media, that, you go back to your list and you contact the people that and I wasn't ready to hang the skates up yet. And, there were a few groups that I had some conversations with, but nothing like the conversation that I was having with Brock and his team. And what they've built is amazing. And we're pretty excited about bringing that company and that product stack into the Canadian marketplace, adding some folks in Canada to localize it. And then we're going to do the UK, and then we're going to go into some other places that they won't let me talk about yet. But yeah, I'm now hiring, and we are going to be building out a local team in the Canadian markets. So to all my friends in Canada that would be interested in a really cool ride, please reach out to me direct on LinkedIn. We have brought on some Canadian partners already. It's been less than a month, but I know a few people that are interested in making some noise. So yeah, it's going to be really cool what we're going to do. And we're going to help a lot of local businesses, and we're going to help a lot of partners in the delivery of their advertising solutions to those customers.
George, your job title is President of International Partnerships. And as a partner person myself, when I hear partners, it means different things to different people. Can you unpack for us what your specific role is and what role these partnerships play in AdCellerant's go-to-market strategy?
The entire AdCellerant business model has been built on partnerships with media companies and agencies, not necessarily selling direct to local businesses. You use the partner to do that work, and you provide them with the solutions and the sales methodology sometimes and the training. So when I talk about partners, though, in the Canadian marketplace, we are not going to attack the Canadian marketplace with a net. We're attacking it with a spear. And I'm fortunate that I know folks and I know their organizations and I know where there's going to be a fit. So as much as we're being interviewed by folks to look at our organization, I'm interviewing them as well. And we're not going to have hundreds of partners. We're going to have 10 or 15 of the right partners. We're going to lean in deeply with those partners, not just lip service around the word leaning in, but I mean truly leading in and putting headcount and putting investment against the partnership. But on that partnership, it's a two-way street. And, Quang, when you and I met and you were working in the media space, we had lots of partners. And some of those partners weren't partners, meaning they were not prepared to make the investment on their side. We were making the investment on our side. And lo and behold, we ended up burning dollars. I'm too old for that shit. We are going to sit down with the partner, come up with a really great agreement that we both agree to, and then we're going to go out and conquer. That's the way that I see partnerships. And I don't think that I'm the only one, because as I've been speaking to other folks that are deeply embedded in the partner space on the tech channel side, you want to see partnerships. Go talk to some folks at Tech Data and Ingram Micro on that side of it. You really want to learn about partnerships, because there's definite skin in the game on both sides. And that's what I'm talking about.
I talk to people about partners a lot. And maybe the thing that people forget about is, before you just say, let's go recruit some partners, the two questions you need to ask are, what capabilities am I asking of this partner? What gap are they going to fill? And how many of those partners do I need? Because it can't just be, let's go sign everybody up and see who floats to the top, because partners talk. They know when you're talking to other people. And if they feel as though you're not, to your point, George, if you're not approaching them with the same respect and partnership offering that you're giving them, they aren't interested. It's not going to work.
Yeah. And we probably caused some of these problems over the years by signing tens of thousands of partners. And COVID didn't help, because everybody was an individual contributor trying to start their own thing because they had time. And by we, I'm talking about back in the Vendasta days. And, that business is growing up as well, to realize that you just can't sign everybody and let God sort them out, because the cost structure around that, it isn't going to work out. And what will happen is you don't have the resources to put against your biggest opportunities. So everybody loses in that model. And we made a lot of changes to that in my last 4 years at Vendasta to get that right. And it's interesting, where we learned the most was in what I call disengaged customers. Like, they're literally almost 2 feet out the door, and you get them back on a call, and that's a sales pitch and a half that you have to give. Trying to save those customers, but also trying to learn from what got them to where they were, help to form more solid partnerships. And in that role of chief customer officer, one of your big jobs is to fix churn. And the only way you're going to fix it is to figure out why it's occurring. So I think that partnerships still are a very, very strong way to go to business, but it definitely is not a quantity play. It is a quality play where there has to be a two-way fit.
And not to get super tactical on selling with partners, but sometimes the best messenger for your company and your product is just not you. If the message comes from someone who has a different email address, that can be extremely powerful in breaking into accounts and having a message that lands with the prospect in a more authentic way. People are just afraid to reach out and talk to their partners.
I think that they're afraid of what they're going to hear. And I think that what they're going to hear are the things that are keeping them awake at night. And, there are a number of things that I admire about Brendan King as a leader and an entrepreneur and a CEO. But that guy, if you give him a problem, that problem is being solved right now. I remember going into one-on-ones. Yeah, the CTO, he's not getting back to me. Well, let's phone him up and get him in. And then I realized what was going on there. So you got to be careful when you go into those meetings. But I learned a lot from that. There's probably been a podcast somewhere out there where it says, do the shitty stuff first. And that's why people don't get on the phone with the partner, is because they already know what they're going to hear. What they're worried about is they're going to hear it from 20 of them. And now we got a serious problem that I probably should have told the board.
Going back to something you shared earlier around AI changing the game, which I fully subscribe to. It's, I think, even beyond what we can imagine at this point. And this always learning, always staying knowledgeable and pushing yourself. So what should sales leaders be doing as it relates to AI to stay ahead of the market, stay on top of things? Like, what should they be reading when they're in their hot tub on a Friday night or Saturday night?
The best part is you don't even have to read anymore. You just have to go to YouTube and you can find a voice or a face or something that doesn't annoy you, and you can start to take an online course and it doesn't cost you anything. The other thing is that, you're listening to this show right now. You better know the ecosystem. You better know what's going on. Last year, I spent 2 days pretty much to the day at an AI conference in Vegas. Just happened to be going on when I was down there for something else. It cost $1,400, so it was cheap. Day one, I was so jazzed up. Like it was awesome. Day two, I was like looking for a deserted island to move to, because day one was all of what AI could do and how amazing it's going to be and our lives are going to be better. And then day two was like, whoa. And like, we've got to understand that stuff. We've got to understand the good and the bad. We got to understand the risk, and we've got to understand the opportunity. And if this sounds like a foreign language to you, you are already behind, significantly behind, and you got to play catch up. Now, the good news is it's easy to consume content, and you just got to get it scheduled into your day or into your week or your month that you're going to do it. But there is no, well, I think I might adopt AI if it becomes a thing. It is already starting to change the business. And if you do not get into it, you're going to get ran over by a freight train. And I truly believe that. When you have somebody like Toby Lutke at Shopify, who said a couple of weeks ago that he will not accept a request for more headcount without you proving that you can't do the job with AI. And that's one of the more successful Canadian leaders out there. But I would say you put Shopify up against any tech company on the planet. So, let's get with it. Let's get moving and start learning how to build a nice little prompt. It's not all business, because I took some pictures of my grandkids the other day and I turned them into cartoons and sent them back to them, and they thought I was the coolest ever. So, you can do some cool shit as well outside of work.
Building memories for the next generation.
It's like I painted an oil painting of my grandkids, right?
Just
Like,
tell
that's
them,
what it's going to be
tell them
like.
that grandpa spent all weekend oil painting in the garage to deliver this masterpiece back.
Well, that is what I told them.
Yeah.
So now they're going to watch
exactly.
this podcast one day and go, oh, that SOB was lying.
Well, that's what editing is for.
Leave it in.
George, these were some awesome insights and amazing stories. Thank you so much for sharing your career story with us. We're going to be back next week with another conversation with George, diving into a very specific chapter of his business career. Tune in, and we'll see you next week.